some insight. We are now joined by Dr. Abraham Rugo from the International Budget Program, alongside Solomon Kariuki, a financial analyst, to help us understand the weight of what this proposal by the National Treasury means to the country. Gentlemen, raising the debt ceiling is already causing apprehension among the general public. Are we going ahead of ourselves on to meet our insatiable debt appetite? Mr. Rugo?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brian. I think I completely associate myself with the sentiments of the fellow Kenyans who spoke earlier. What is troubling about the debt situation is that what you read in the reports, both by Parliament and even some coming from the Treasury, completely contradicts the actions, because the reports and the proposals suggest that we should be focusing more on essential spending, on trying to balance as much as possible our expenditure with our revenue. But the actions are the ones that you see, that the net effect. The focus now is on raising our public. I think a big concern is that we are definitely going above what the country can handle. We are going completely off, any measure of fiscal prudence. And that comes to bite, because there are certain principles which, when you negate, definitely come to bite. When you are spending more than two times more in debt repayment than you are spending, than you are collecting in revenue, then that tells you that there is a problem. So this is not just empty talk, really. The numbers are already speaking for themselves, and I think it should be of concern to everyone. So for me, the repayment question is critical. The accountability question is critical.
Thank you so much for that. And of course, we'll look at some of the effects, as you put it, the economic depression, as one of the Kenyans put it on the streets there. But let's now look at the reasons why we borrow. And the government says that we borrow to sustain national projects. Could you comment briefly on this, and especially on the return on investment of these projects that are being borrowed for, and generally why we borrow as a country?
So I think it's right to say, and to be fair, is that borrowing is almost, is one of the mechanisms of financing development, partly because often the projects that you need to spend, especially infrastructure, capital projects, let me say like that, require far much more than your revenue collection at the moment is. This also happens at individual level, at household level, that when people are engaging in huge capital projects, they would often borrow. But I don't think that's where the issue is. The issue is, when you borrow the resources, first, are you putting them into economically viable projects, which basically then will, because that has been the argument. But when you look at the analysis, including the numbers that the Cabinet Secretary presented in his report on 1st of December of 2020, you notice that now basically there's also a fair amount of borrowing that is borrowing to refinance previous debts. So basically, it's getting money to be able to take care of other debt that we had borrowed before. That's where then it becomes a challenge, because then the return on investment is a big question. And I know Solomon will say more from a financial perspective. So yes, we had anticipated that we would actually borrow, because the projects that are advanced were expected and are being done under Vision 2030 in the various medium-term plans are huge in nature. But there's been questions around accountability. There's been questions around how transparent those resources are being spent. There's been a question, particularly with the example of SGR, of what is the return on investment of some of this spending. As you know, right now, SGR cannot pay for itself. So we are having to spend more money from other sources. And what happens is that then borrowing ceases to be the issue, debt ceases to be the issue, and the issue then becomes mere survival, because for you to be able to take care of debts that are not performing, then you are inevitably taking money away from other essential services that are critical for the country.
Fair enough, sir. Thank you so much for those sentiments. I understand Solomon Kariuki, a financial analyst, is now with us. Solomon, I just want to pick your mind briefly on this because the IMF has already given a red flag to Kenya and to so many other countries that if the borrowing continues to go like this, then perhaps we stand not to sustain it. So what could be at stake if the government pushes the debt ceiling from 9 trillion to 12 trillion? What is at stake for us as a country?
So thanks, Abby. So you find that there isn't push by the government to add the debt ceiling from 9 to 12 trillion so that they can give themselves or give the government can get a little bit of headroom in terms of borrowing. So you find that currently the public debt is currently at around 7.1 and another 1.3 and is passed. So you find that the total debt is around 8.4 trillion. So with the current now 9 trillion shilling, the ceiling being 9 trillion, then you find like the government is around 600 billion away from hitting the ceiling. So that's why you find that there is a push for the ceiling to go to 12 billion, so that you can find that now the government will have around 2.6 more to 3.6 more billion that they can borrow. So what this means is that now we are putting our other debt at stake because what can be seen actually even in the during the 9 months of the pandemic that we have borrowed our debt has grown by around 800 billion. So the government is at a crossroads because they need to borrow more to finance the deficit that is currently there and that has always been there. And then the government also is at crossroads because they need to stimulate the economy to get back to where it was, because once the economy is not doing well, then there's revenue underperformance. So an increase in the debt ceiling means that now the government has given itself an opportunity to borrow more. And borrowing more now, as Abraham had said, that some of these projects that we're investing in, then they are proving not to be worthwhile in terms of the returns. He gave an example of the SGR, whereby you find that the revenue for around the first 5 months of 2020 were around, I think, 5 billion, and the expenditure is 7 billion. So you find that now the taxpayers have to go back to their pockets and now service the operating cost of the SGR. So some of these projects that we're investing in, we are borrowing to invest in, then are putting the whole borrowing infrastructure into jeopardy, because we find that now the borrowing itself now it's putting even the taxpayers in a strain, because now they have to be taxed more and everything else. So this means that now the government has to be keen on what kind of borrowing that they're going to get into, in as much as you're going to increase the ceiling.
Many thanks, Mr. Solomon. Still staying with you on this question, and now let's look at the policy. One Kenyan there commented and said that we need to make the Public Debt Management Authority autonomous. How will that affect the way we borrow? Is it like we're going to make it independent, and how will that affect the way we borrow as a country and our general debt management strategy?
Well, you see, our issue is not actually what we borrow, it's how we spend what we borrow. Okay. So I think I would suggest that we have a board on checking on how we spend, more so not on how to borrow, but on how to spend. Because you find, even if we have the board, I think this is an issue we have as a country, that every time there is an issue, we form a committee or a board that can look into the issue. So maybe my recommendations to the National Treasury is that in as much as you're going to have a board to monitor on how we borrow, then the same board maybe can have mandate on how we spend the money that we borrow, because that has been our biggest issue. Because you can borrow as much as you want. Even some of the developed countries have a huge debt to GDP ratio than us, but then you find that whatever amount of money that they borrow then is always invested in the right projects that bring the right returns and maybe create job opportunities. And creating job opportunities then means there is a lot of pay to be paid, there is a lot of tax to be paid, and that then now is located in the part of now revenues that KRA is collecting. So you find that in as much as the board now is looking at how much money we are borrowing, then you should also look or have a mandate on how are we spending this money, and is it prudently being spent.
Let me bring in Mr. Abraham Rugo. You had mentioned earlier on about the effects of this sort of debt appetite that may plunge the country into some sort of economic depression. In just 1 minute, what would be the effect of excessive borrowing, and then give your recommendations to the government perhaps on this issue?
I think the effects that we are talking about are not effects that will come, are effects we are already feeling. One of them, of course, is that we are spending quite a huge amount on debt servicing, and therefore that means we are already crowding out essential services to the extent that we are having to borrow money to be able to pay salaries and other recurrent expenditures, which is not the essence of why we borrow. So I think that effect is already being felt. What then means is that if you're not providing public services, then citizens have to rely on private services. I think my recommendation, and these are not new things, these are things we have said to the National Treasury and also to Parliament. I think one is that Parliament has to step up in its accountability role. I do not think that even creating an authority for public debt is an issue. There is an institution that passes year on year the public debt management strategy that passes the deficit. And once you approve a deficit, you approve borrowing. So I think there is that critical mandate. But secondly, it cannot be that every other institution, every other individual and household is having to make cuts on their expenditure because their incomes have gone down, but government expenditure is going up when its revenue is going down. I mean, that is not prudence at all. I think the language of fiscal consolidation, the language of spending, cutting non-core expenditure, that's what I talked about. Language is there. The statements are there. Can that be followed with actual actions? Because we'll get to a point whereby it will be impossible to service the debts. It will be impossible to provide critical services. We've seen countries like Greece go down this road, and we know the effects. Finally, you actually cannot run any of the expenses. I think for me, that's critical. I don't think there's any other way apart from a fair level of austerity, a fair level of fiscal consolidation, as we inject money in where people are able to make incomes and therefore be able, because even when you raise taxes to try and fill some of these gaps, if the economy is not performing, if there's no proper investments being done, it means then therefore, and the numbers are already showing for that. So I think at the moment, I would go strongly for cutting expenditure as a way of balancing things out and not just going to borrow more and raising the ceiling. I don't think that is a solution. The solution, to a debt-ridden person institution is not allowing them to borrow more. It's injecting some sense of fiscal prudence and responsibility, in my opinion.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for those sentiments concerning the issue of debt in our country. We have been speaking to Mr. Abraham Rugo, who works at the International Budget Partnership, and of course Solomon Kariuki, a financial analyst at Saiton, who have been just commentating on the debt issue.